Hello, I'm Night Novel, your humble storyteller for this evening. Welcome back to 𝐏𝐚𝐥𝐞 𝐂𝐚𝐜. Things are looking dire. Seina's acting out of it. We're in the cemetery. We've had a vision of something terrible down in the mausoleum, possibly killing Isaiah. I'm not sure. All I know is that it's a dark, dark time. I'm sorry, Esther. Turning away, Esther began to trudge back towards the manor. She couldn't fully process things at first. The world seemed surreal, as if she had entered a completely different universe from the one she'd been living in the past few weeks. When she tried to analyze it all, to imagine how things would play out from here, it felt like her mind was too clouded to contemplate more than a few moments ahead. Oh, we went all the way back. And before she knew it, she was standing back in the manor, staring blankly at the stairs. For a moment, she considered sleeping on the sofa. Seina clearly didn't want to see her, and returning to the living room was a good reminder that Esther was only a temporary guest. But the more she reflected on the idea, the more it seemed like a childish, pathetic ploy for sympathy. A subconscious attempt to guilt Seina, to gain her pity. It was better to just rest in the bedroom, even if she did risk making the other girl angry at her instead. Maybe it'll all be better in the morning. Sleep, however, soon proved impossible. Despite the fatigue that still hung over her, strings of bitter thoughts kept worming into Esther's mind, infesting it with further doubts and uncertainties. All the things she could have said to comfort Seina better, to give her the support she was clearly longing for. An endless well of missed opportunities and imagined outcomes, once where they had reconciled, not gone their separate ways. Well, don't look at me, Esther. I don't have any choices in this story. She hadn't done anything wrong. The rational, level-headed part of her realized that perfectly well. But another, louder part of her said it was all her fault. She should have worked harder, acted more lively, learned how to understand Seina better. Esther wasn't the one who deserved pity. She wasn't the one who'd lost her father and had been living in isolation since the beginning. She was so privileged in comparison, and yet she still had the nerve to feel sorry for herself. Those thoughts clouded in her head like screaming voices, drowning out every rational plea to absolve herself of guilt. Seina deserves better. She'd be better off alone than with someone like you. Stupid, self-centered girl. Never making progress, always falling back into the same patterns of thought. And no matter how much she reassured you, it meant nothing. You're hopelessly lost in your own head. So very, very, very selfish. She tossed and turned, desperately praying for sleep to finally come and relieve her again. Until, at some point, the bedroom door finally opened. After a long pause, Esther heard the light padding of Seina's footsteps, approaching the bed with clear reluctance. A drawer opening, clothes shuffling as she changed into her nightgown. Then, a small weight pressed down the mattress beside her, and the covers shifted upward. She was lying facing away from Seina. She could sense the other girl was facing away from her, too. It felt so strange. The two of you had gotten so close. Good night, Esther. soft, nearly inaudible whisper completely caught her off guard. It was so quiet, she almost missed it. Seina must have been unsure whether she was still awake or not. She wanted to say something in return, anything, in the vain hope that it would finally break the awful tension between them. But she couldn't. A mortified guilt kept her petrified, too ashamed and afraid to even acknowledge the other girl. So she laid in silence, pretending she was fast asleep. Eventually, Seina's breathing fell into a slow, steady rhythm. As upset and hurt as she was, listening to the quiet sound helped soothe Esther, if only a little bit. It proved enough to help her slowly drift off, somewhat comforted that Seina had come to rest beside her instead of downstairs. The circling thoughts in her head disintegrated little by little, falling into incoherent images and pieces, until at last, her consciousness finally faded away. And this is where we usually go into an Isaiah vision, so I'm super curious. Did he perish in the mausoleum, or did he return? And is this when Seina said that he was crazy running away from spirits? Oh boy, I think the latter. The disease is now reaching its final stages. A steady degeneration of the patient's physical and mental state, with brief episodes of elevated energy and intense panic. These symptoms are occasionally seen in those who suffer from the pale for an extended period. There is still no documented case of recovery from such an advanced progression of the disease. I do not fully understand the cause of my sudden decline, but I suspect it was invoked by a powerful fear. The hallucinations I suffered inside the crypt caused me significant stress, which likely increased the pale's aggressiveness. When I awoke on the ground outside the mausoleum, it was already nearly morning. I suspect I must have entered a delusional panic as I fled from what I witnessed. Whether they were apparitions of the Araphel or simply a reflection of my unstable mental condition, it no longer feels relevant in my last term of illness. Seina, of course, had never entered the catacombs. After our conflict, she ran to my study to wait for me, in a twist of fate, the only place I never thought to search. In the weeks since then, my previously abated symptoms have not only returned, but triggered the rapid deterioration of my health. There's little I can do but continue to study and write, making use of my remaining time in the hopes I may... The pen fell from Isaiah's fingertips, clattering onto the desk. Blinking, he studied his own trembling hand with morbid interest. His pale, skeletal fingers were mottled with ink, like a disease had discolored his pallid flesh. Between a loss of motor control and energy, it was becoming increasingly difficult to write. It served as a constant, painful reminder for the impending reality he was forced to accept. He was withering away. Both his body and his mind were breaking down. Soon, he would no longer be recognizable to himself or to Seina. He couldn't bring himself to speak of it to her. The thought of making her cry again, leaving that as one of the last memories they would share with each other. It was too painful to even consider. The almanacs, directions to the city. The rest of my damned gold. Oh, where is it? Shuffling through and stacking up his papers, Isaiah attempted to work himself into a flurry of impatient, productive activity. It was his usual method of distancing himself from things he didn't want to think about, but this time, the effort only met with abject failure. Tears blurred his vision, burning behind his eyes no matter how hard he glared. They spilled over and dragged down his sharp cheekbones, falling onto the layers of parchment in a soft, muffled patter. How would she think of him when he was gone? Would she hate him? It would be fully deserved with how much he had failed her as a father. He had come so close to abandoning her at the orphanage, even if that would have led her to a better family. A life in the city, a childhood surrounded by friends, a world beyond the boundaries of this forest. A world that perhaps she could still find happiness in, even if it meant leaving him behind. No, it's too late. Far too late for me to ever give her that. He mumbled under his breath, clenching his jaw tightly. Far too late. The best he could do was help Seina provide for herself, to live freely and happily when he was gone. That was all. He repeated those words inside his mind, trying desperately to believe them. He was hopeless, powerless. There was nothing more he could do. Nothing more. A nauseating, guilty weight gnawed at his stomach. Slowly, he began to reach for the fallen quill, his fingers frail and trembling as they brushed its feather. If he could only just explain himself to her. If he could go back and remake everything, patch over all his choices and falsehoods, all of his misguided words. But she only had one childhood, and when he died, it would be over. There was no time left for forgiveness. As he clutched his head with both hands, hoarse sobs began to leak from his throat, a pathetic noise that he loathed to hear. Grief and anger, fear and self-hatred, guilt and final resignation. Blankly staring at the wall, a stream of wretched tears swallowing his words, all remaining thoughts dissolving into empty regret. He wept. I really feel for Isaiah. I didn't think I would. A beautiful, sunny morning. She stood before the window, gazing up into the clear sky as she carefully buttoned her blouse. Seina was already gone. Just like the previous day, her side of the bed had been neatly remade, the sheets tucked in beneath her pillow and smoothed to perfection. Let's hope she made breakfast. As Esther descended the stairs, she could hear the birds keeping up their cheerful chorus outside. It felt warmer today. Summer was steadily approaching, and soon everything would be bright, beautiful, and flowering. Nearly a year ago, she'd set out during this same warm weather, full of determination, putting all of her faith into the plan she'd carefully mapped out. And now, after all this time, her closest lead was crumbling into dust. Perhaps it had been foolish to expect anything more. It's a dangerous train of thought, Esther. In the empty parlor, Esther saw a small note left out on the desk. She hesitated to pick it up. Somehow she felt like she already knew what it would say. Okay, here we go. Dear Esther, when we first made our arrangements, I was being too selfish. So I've changed my mind. You don't have to worry about helping me with chores anymore. I can handle things by myself. I think you should focus on finishing with Papa's research instead. I doubt there's too much left to check, is there? If you spend the next few days just going through the bookshelves, it'll be much faster and more practical than what we're doing now. Wouldn't you agree? I set some food out for you in the kitchen. Please eat something so you can stay healthy. I'll see you tonight. I want to go back to the bright days. When we were joking together, when we were hugging each other and playing in the sunlight. How have I already lost that? The nauseated, anxious feeling in her stomach made eating seem beyond unthinkable. But Seina was right. If she wanted to finish going through Isaiah's research, she had to keep up a semblance of strength. Esther didn't want to burden her any longer. After forcing herself to gulp down a small amount of food, Esther made her way back to the study. Being here so early in the morning, especially on such a beautiful day, felt strangely wrong. On mornings like this, they often went out to the stream or had breakfast in the garden. Seina had promised to show Esther more of her favorite picnic spots soon. Well, no picnics for us. Attempting to force away her intrusive thoughts, Esther resumed her search for the missing pages. But the dull, unrewarding nature of the task left her mind far too free to wander, and naturally, it kept returning to her situation with Seina. Slowly, she was beginning to piece together what had likely happened. Yesterday, the study door was closed, even though she'd left it open. It was possible Seina had shut it while passing by, but more likely, she'd been inside and found the journal entry Esther had pulled out. With a sinking feeling, she checked to confirm her suspicions. And sure enough, the page was missing. Not only was it an indirect warning left behind by Isaiah, but Esther had also kept completely silent about what she'd seen. Seina must have realized that she read it, and yet Esther was still in no hurry to leave, even though Isaiah clearly wouldn't have wanted her there. How could she ever expect Seina to prioritize a stranger over the wishes of her deceased father? A father who she obviously adored, and who adored her in turn, despite his bitter ways. Even if she felt it was wrong to keep Seina isolated, it wasn't her decision to make. And in the end, if Seina decided to follow Isaiah's wishes, Esther had no right to hold it against her. She was only honoring her father's memory, living how he had always wanted her to. She knew that. She knew that, and yet... Esther took a long, deep breath to try and refocus. A heavy lump had formed in her throat. She had to concentrate to swallow it down, to force away the emotion rising in her chest. It was time for her to accept things and move on. She would learn a lesson from all this and continue life with greater wisdom to fall back on if it happened again. It would be all right. In the end, everything would be all right. Okay, yeah, but can we go talk to Seina? At least, we need to talk. At least let her know that we know and that we're sorry, apologize for not saying, but recognize how difficult the situation is. We can't just not talk and send passive notes to each other. After a few minutes, Esther managed to calm herself down. Once she had managed to regain a grip on her composure, she began to search for Isaiah's treatise with even more focused intensity, pushing away any encroaching thoughts or feelings as they came to her. She deliberately ignored every journal page about his daily life, especially anything that mentioned Seina, and concentrated solely on finding something about the 𝘏𝑚. But as the hours passed and morning turned into afternoon, her efforts still met with no success. It was so difficult not to let herself get exasperated. She could feel her focus waning again, and the heavy weight of the pail only worsened the sensation clouding her head. Realizing that it made more sense to take a short break than to keep pushing, Esther picked up a random stray paper and sat down at the desk with a quiet sigh. The writing was even messier than his previous entries, scribbled in such obvious haste that it nearly became incomprehensible. But as her eyes roamed across the page, Esther found herself getting steadily more absorbed in the disturbing writing. As if her mind was falling into step with Isaiah's own, she could decipher everything, understand it, feel it. As if she were there beside him. Oh, don't say that. I boarded up the windows and barricaded the doors. I'm too terrified to light a candle, for its glow will surely betray me in the dark. I understand now that what I witnessed was no hallucination. No, I am not mad after all. The 𝘏𝑚 have not forgotten me. I fled into the darkness, and I stirred those living fears from their deep sleep. Some of them took hold of me, seeped into my mind and body to hasten my decay, to ruin me with a vengeance. But from the others, I managed to escape. And now, they are coming for me. They are waiting in the shadows, listening for my breath. I could feel the same rejection of life rising in my stomach like before, this bile of hatred for my own existence. It is their punishment. It is a premonition of what they will have me do. They will drive me to kill myself. By writing this, I am only bringing them closer to me. They are so close now. Nothing will keep them out. Nothing will save me. All I can do is run. The quill snapped between his trembling fingers. A chilling draft had leaked through the window, boarded up and secure as he thought it was. His stomach began to slowly knot itself in pure dread. Not safe. He wasn't safe. They were almost here. Morning. Just until morning. He pushed himself up to his feet in a sudden clumsy movement, sending his papers scattering off the desk. A small beaker of fluid fell to one side, spilling its contents onto the floor, but the man failed to notice. Morning. That was it. If he could just run, flee, escape them until the morning. He could still live. Racing over to his door, he froze as his fingers brushed the doorknob. Careful. He had to be careful. He pressed his ear to the door, held his breath, and listened. Silence. It was safe. With a shuddering exhale of relief, he crept into the hallway and down the stairs. Okay, I remember Seina told us something about witnessing her dad, talking about shadows and barricading the windows. We might be at her final memory of Isaiah now. He doesn't have long. 2 large bookshelves and a chair were barricading the front door, but he only needed to remove one of the shelves to slip outside. Quickly, quietly. Before long, he had stumbled outside into the swirling mists that surrounded the manor. The frigid wind drained the color and feeling from his face, but it was a welcome numbness. Where can I go? Where? No, it doesn't matter. Anywhere. Far, far away. Not here. Slurred words rasped from his lips, clouded with the confusion of a man half asleep. He began to fall forward, but instead of spilling to the ground, the momentum sent his body stumbling through the grass. A lurching walk, then a jog. Faster, faster. Soon he had broken into a steady run. He had to get away. He had to get away from it all. But his footfalls were loud, so loud. The faster he ran, the more they heard him. They were close now, getting closer. No, he was safe. He'd be safe, stayed safe, as long as he kept running. He thought he was safe, knew he was safe, had to be safe. And he was safe until he looked behind him. Fear sliced through his skull. For a moment, everything went black. When his eyes reopened, he was running. Why? Why? He left. He was gone. They couldn't catch him here. They couldn't follow him. No, he didn't want to die. He didn't want to suffer. He didn't deserve to suffer. He hadn't done anything wrong. They knew it. In that moment, the world warped and shifted. Horrible screams pierced his ears, familiar screams calling out his name. Shouting, hating, weeping, screaming. The cries of all those he had hurt in his selfishness. No! No! They were in front of him, running from him. Running from him as he ran now, fleeing from those who'd come to collect him. Their voices warped and twisted into shrieks, cutting through his brain like knives of penance. Please, please, stop it. Stop it. No, please. He grabbed his head with both hands, covering his ears. But the sound only echoed louder.
There is no monster here. There is no monster out there. It's only you.
No, it can't be. Suddenly, he staggered forward. All the strength in his body was gone. In an instant, he crumpled to the ground, twitching and convulsing. Move! His body would no longer respond. Every function gone. His brain was trapped in a husk, a casket. They had buried him alive. He would lie here and rot, watch himself rot. Hours and hours, helpless, insects and animals eating him, every scream silent. He deserved it. His punishment. The punishment they gave him. No. The punishment he'd given to himself. Esther suddenly gasped for air. Oh, don't tell me we're lying in the forest now. Her lungs burned, her legs ached. Had she been running? How? How is that possible? Just a moment ago, she'd been reading Isaiah's journal. How had she gotten here? All of a sudden, hazy memories flooded back to her. A few minutes ago, no, hours ago, she left Isaiah's study. Something had called out to her. A sudden, intense, overwhelming urge that she couldn't resist. A call to follow Isaiah. Wasn't it? She needed to get away, to get out of the manor, away from her own thoughts. And so she tore down the stairs in a panic, nearly tripping over herself in her frantic need to flee. There was no sign of Seina as she ran across the manor grounds. She must have been in the cemetery. But Esther ran the opposite way, into the forest, the same deep woods she'd come from, throwing herself carelessly forward. Had she been fleeing all this time? Impossible. When she glanced up at the sky, the sun was just past its highest point. If that many hours had truly passed, then she had fled a decent way from the manor. Getting back would be a difficult task, especially since she had initially found the place by sheer luck. Oh, we don't have the key either, do we? Seina has that. So how do we get back? She had no map, no compass. All she could do was try and strain her memory back several weeks prior and seek out any features she'd passed by. A ridiculous plan, certainly. But there were hardly any other options. We don't even have our watch. Oh. Okay. It's tracking time. Hope you were a Girl Scout, Esther. Trying her best to keep her spirits up, Esther began wandering through the trees. She still felt slightly dazed, brought from her lapse in consciousness and the events of the past 2 days. Earlier that morning, she thought she was fine. Not in the best of spirits, of course, but still prepared to make peace with it all and move on. And yet somehow, her subconscious mind had grown so unsettled that she'd run away in a fugue state, something that had never happened before. Were her real feelings truly that disturbed, deep down? Had she been so upset by Seina's rejection that she fled the manor in an attack of anxiety? It was frustrating and embarrassing, to say the least, and she wanted to think of herself as far more resilient than that. But, in the end, perhaps it was much more than just a friend throwing her away. Perhaps it was a confirmation of what she'd feared all along, that she was never meant to find what she truly longed for. What exactly it was that she longed for, Esther couldn't say for certain. All she knew was that Seina embodied it, somehow. The more Esther dwelled on that idea, the more afraid she grew at the thought of seeing the other girl again. Maybe it was better if she didn't go back. After all, the sooner she could distance herself and start to recover, the better. And of course, she didn't want to hurt Seina or make things any more difficult for her. She'd already done so much for Esther, and the thought of straining her further, especially after last night, seemed unbearable. Leaving, then, would surely be the best choice. For both of them. Oh, you shut your mouth, girl. You shut your mouth right now. Oh, I think she remembered the compass. Not the compass, the watch. Suddenly, Esther froze. A horrible thought struck her out of nowhere, making her blood run cold. The watch. She didn't have the watch. Her medicine. With no way to tell where she was, she'd never be able to return to the road in time to call for help. But if she'd only gone a few hours from the manor, at least Esther knew she had a chance to make it back. There was no other choice. If she didn't retrieve it, she'd fall into a catatonic state as soon as her dose ran out. She had to find the manor again, and before nightfall. Otherwise, everything would be utterly for naught. Well, that's a way to up the stakes. Okay, well, things are getting more and more dire. I decided to turn off the lights when I played this time around, and that whole section we just did was not fun in the dark. Like, I wanted to look over my shoulder. This visual novel gets you on edge. But with that, we're going to close the page on this evening's story. But of course, there's still more left to tell. So stay safe, take care of yourself, and please, return here whenever you wish. This is Night Novel, signing off.